or privacy nets, or there's a lot of miscommunication and a lot of misinformation. And so I think maybe by figuring out why you're in this room and what you're concerned about, maybe I'll be able to better answer some of your questions. Otherwise, I'm just shooting in the dark, kind of telling you my opinions when it might be better to actually address some of your concerns. So does that sound like a plan? Sounds like a plan. Good. Okay. So let's get started. I have my voluminous notes right here. This is the roadmap for the conversation. And I want to start by asking you, how many people, by a show of hands, a dark net. Do you have an opinion of what a dark net is? Anybody really? Okay. Is a dark net to you something that is not indexed by Google? Right? Is it something that's unindexable? Is that what makes it dark? No. Okay. What makes a dark net dark? Okay. Oh, here's a microphone. Oh.
Okay.
Yeah.
It's people that are working together without knowing who they
are.
are.
So it's like an anonymous group of people
Exactly.
would make it dark.
That's the impression I have, yes.
Okay, so anybody got another competing idea of what a dark... So you could be a member of, say, Facebook group, but have a fake name, and talk to a bunch of other people on Facebook with fake names, and that would be a dark net. Yeah, see, it gets really confusing. That would not be a dark net. Because it's Facebook, or is it because...
Through Facebook, you could get to other people, but for me, a dark net is something that is closed loop.
Closed loop, so it's an invite only.
Yes.
Okay, so it could be, a dark net could be like a credit card fraud forum on the internet where somebody gives you an invite, you join the forum under a fake name, obviously, because you're a criminal, and you start sharing credit card theft information with other criminals under fake names, but you're on the normal internet, you're just behind a username and password to a forum. Would that be a dark net, or would that just be an invite-only forum? That's not a dark net. Right, so what makes a dark net a dark net? And when I get into a conversation with people, people seem to get nervous when it's not easily indexed. So I can't search and find out about the illegal credit card forum. Well, of course you can't search and find the, I mean, the whole point of the credit card forum is not to be found. But if that's not a dark net, so then is it the medium, is it the technology of the transportation? Is it the transportation of the network, not the actual organization? So for example, when I say dark net, show of hands, who thinks I'm saying Tor? Right? Tor is the most popular overlay network that people like to call a dark net. There's others. There's I2P, there's Freenet. You could even argue that a Mixmaster, a remailing network that hides the origin of an email, that could be a dark net if the definition is we're trying to hide the origin. And so I guess part of it is I get really wound up when they start saying that dark nets are bad, and then I start asking them, what's the characteristic about the dark net that you don't approve of? And then they can't really enumerate it. So I've got a couple listed here. And when it boils down to, I think, is that the creation of dark nets, overlay networks, unindexed networks, is part of it, I think, is an expression of creators trying to get control or get agency over their data again. They feel that they can't trust their ISP because the ISP is intercepting all of their traffic and injecting JavaScript advertising. The government is pervasively monitoring them. Advertisers are pervasively tracking them. Maybe you're in a country that doesn't have great freedom of speech. And so you're trying to get out of your country into a more free country to read, say, news articles. So a lot of motivations. But it seems to be it's around a lack of trust. People are not trusting the existing network. They don't trust Facebook. They don't trust their ISP. So they're building new technology. And so it's an interesting thing where I believe if you try, the more you would try to control some of the technology, it's like toothpaste, the more you'll create alternative overlay networks. And so some of my motivations of this, or I have a friend who runs a Tor node. And it's solely designed to allow people to get to the Internet Archive. And so the people who have been using it are in Turkey. Turkey is blocking access to the Internet Archive. So people go through this Tor node to be able to get to the Internet Archive and actually read news about what's going on in Turkey. So that would be, say, a good use of a darknet. And then you can imagine, bad uses of darknets. And so it's almost like the term hacker. It has a good use and a bad use. And by just saying that all darknets are bad, you've closed off half the debate, right? And if you say all darknets are good, you've closed off half the debate because you're not acknowledging the harm that they can be used for. And at the same time that darknets are becoming more and more popular, and Tor is exploding in popularity, you see the IETF, through some of its work, the deprive work, setting standards trying to minimize the collection of personally identifiable information. Through deprive, they're trying to come up with new technologies to reduce the ability for pervasive surveillance, more TLS, more encrypted communication. That's starting to look more and more like a lot of the features you find in some of these dark nets. And so at what point do your concerns about the dark net start to look like your concerns about the normal net? And so I think we'll be reaching that inflection point 4 or 5 years from now. There's encrypted DNS queries now. Most of the internet, 70% or more, is moving to pervasive encryption. How many people here use a VPN on your phone, right? Well, now you're hiding your source identity, right? So are you a participant in a dark net? And then, anyway, we can go down that road. So when you talk to law enforcement and you ask them how much, I'm sorry, sir? I'm sorry.
You still didn't define it.
Oh, I didn't define it because I didn't define darknet because I don't think there's an easy definition. Okay, Bill thinks he has a definition.
It's the network of people you don't like who are communicating with each other.
It's the network of people you don't like that are communicating with each other.
I think it's a question of what's the purpose.
So it's
relevant.
mens rea. It's what's in your head that counts. It's what you're thinking while you're on the keyboard.
What you're going to do with it. What's the purpose?
So then the internet is the dark net.
No. The purpose. What makes it a dark, the dark net can have a good use or a bad use. It's
Right.
the purpose.
Yeah, so then I guess the bigger question I have in these conversations is, from your perspective, do you have a right to build a secure network? You either are allowed to build a secure network or you're not. Your government either says you can build a secure computer or all computers in your country have to be insecure. You can strive to build a secure network or you have to intentionally have backdoors and have insecure networks. Because if you're going to allow secure computers, if you're going to allow secure networks, you're going to have dark nets, right? And you're going to have a trade-off. There's going to be an equities conversation there between the balance. But that's one of the first trade-offs. Right? Do you have a right to be unindexed? Do I have a right to have a conversation with you that's not recorded forever for law enforcement or my spouse to sue me over or whatever? Are we allowed to have unrecorded conversations? Right? So fundamentally, there's a couple questions you need to answer. And when you talk to law enforcement about it, They say, well, you know, we deploy normal law enforcement techniques no matter what you're doing. If you're in an airplane, you're on a submarine, you're on a dark net, we follow the money. We infiltrate the crime groups, and we go wherever the crime groups are going. If the crime groups are all going to a web carding forum, we're going to the web carding forum because we're embedded in the criminal groups. So we're going to follow them, and we'll learn where all these groups are. There's a lot of technical attacks, and you hear about this all the time. The people who operate some of these darknet sites are not the world's best administrators, and they make mistakes, and this is how they caught a lot of the underground markets on Tor. They're technical attacks all the time. 0 days, governments hoard exploits, use them to identify criminals. So it's not like you magically go on a darknet and you'll never be found. Normal investigative techniques help. And if you think about this, if I buy a prepaid cell phone, am I on a darknet? Right? If I write you an anonymous letter and drop it in the mail, and I'm wearing gloves so I leave no fingerprints, right? People already have ways to communicate anonymously. But for some reason, when we start talking about the darknet, we start behaving differently. And I'm really fascinated like why that is. The expectations are different, I think. I think the expectation is when you build a network, we can sort of all know, all see, and when you start explaining to people it doesn't work that way, they don't like that. They don't like that answer. So anyway, so those are some of my thoughts. I could get into, the other part is, there's this book written, and I can't remember the name of the author, but I can remember the name of the book. It's called The Big Switch. And The Big Switch follows technologies from their inception to them losing favor. So for example, in the early days, going from black and white movies to color movies, going from radio to mass market radio, right? It used to be a lot of individuals operated radio and a very local, and then it became a national giant transmitter. Same thing with television. It became nationalized. And then when people didn't like that, they moved on to the next thing, the telegraph, the telephone. We're in the internet phase right now, but when the internet stops providing services the consumers want and only provides services that businesses want, you will see the invention of new technology. There'll be a new overlay network, a new internet, because that's when, historically, every technology has changed. And at some point, we'll run into that point. We're not going to live in this state forever. And the expression of this, I see, is through these alternative overlay networks, alternative namespaces, alternative closed communities. What they're trying to do is create an alternative because they're unhappy with the existing status quo. Anybody got any questions, or I can keep going? Okay. So if you look at some of these networks, they're pretty difficult to use. And if you think about Tor, for example, because it's unindexed, that means it's hard to find anything. And if you've used Tor for any period of time, it quickly gets really frustrating. You know, there's supposedly 30,000 sites on Tor. That's how big it is, about 30,000 sites. Over 60% of them are dead. They're like not responsive, they're only up some point of the time. So there's like maybe 20-something thousand sites on Tor. And good luck finding them. The most popular ones you can find easily, otherwise you really need to find someone to tell you the address to go to. So it's not like it's just a quick replacement for the existing web. And because it's hopping through multiple nodes, it's slower. So file sharing is slower. So generally you don't see much piracy on these sites, because to gain privacy and anonymity, you're trading off speed. And so you don't see, it's not like people on BitTorrent move to these networks. It would just be so slow. So they seem to be optimum for things like community building around conversations, chat forums, IRC, email replacements. They're not replacements for anything that requires a lot of bandwidth. When Facebook moved there's a Facebook Onion site for Tor. And when you talk to them, why did you do that? They were trying to help dissidents in other countries get to Facebook. So they viewed it as a censorship circumvention move. And the other thing is, at least with the Tor technology, you don't suffer from a lot of the normal attacks. So man-in-the-middle attacks don't work. Some of the recent attacks where Russia or China reroutes BGP traffic through their country, collects user information, and then routes it back, those attacks don't work. So it's actually an enhancement of security for the existing network. So some companies like Facebook look at it and they say, well, these categories of attacks are eliminated. We should probably embrace that. So there's some valid reasons why you see people moving there. The problem also is, if you're trying to use it to organize, you're either talking to people in the network, and if you try to talk out of the network, you've got to go through a gateway. So if you're trying to send mail from inside the network to outside, you would go through a mail gateway. Well, now you're back on the normal web. All the normal surveillance applies. And it turns out that countries like, say, Russia, run an inordinate, like disproportionate number of exit nodes. And the reason they're doing this is they're watching all the traffic leaving the Tor network. And 90-something% of the network of Tor, 95% or so of the network traffic leaves the Tor network. It's used just to anonymize people trying to get to the normal internet, not people trying to stay inside Tor. So if you run, say, a third of the exit nodes, you would see a third of all the traffic coming out from Tor users. And if you look at the statistics of who are running exit nodes, there's just a lot of them in Russia. I wonder why they're doing that. You see a lot in Iran also. So some countries use this to gather information on the normal citizens. If you look at the very beginning days of WikiLeaks, the way they gathered some of that information is they ran an exit node and gathered information of people sharing files. So there's some harm that can be done here, right? You can't necessarily trust these exit nodes. I mentioned earlier other network types. There's one called Freenet. Freenet's all about sharing files, where basically you take a file, chop it up into pieces, encrypt it, and share it into the network. And the idea is that as long as the network's running, your file can be recovered. So it's meant to be resilient, and then I can go anywhere in the world and request that file and get my file back. So you could think of it as file backup. You could think of it as, and it's stored encrypted on people's computers, so I don't know what I'm storing on if I'm participating, I don't know what I'm storing. So I don't have any liability, I just have encrypted things on my drive. And by me donating space on my hard drive, I get to also use space on other people's hard drives. So it's like a mutual resource sharing. So what people did is, instead of sharing files, they started sharing pictures, they started sharing text files. And the text files turned into be HTML pages. And next thing you know, it's sort of a decentralized, slow website that people created. So there's a lot of research going on in this area. And if you're for or against it, you just need to understand. For example, where did the money for Tor come from? It came from the US Navy. Why did the US Navy invest lots of money in building this anonymous network? US Navy was responding to the needs of the US State Department. And the US State Department was realizing when their diplomats all started going to the foreign embassy web pages for, say, Russia, Russia would notice, how come all these people from the US State Department are hammering our website? Something's up. Why do they keep looking at these 3 pages? So they needed a way to hide what the diplomats were looking at and people in government, so they looked like anybody else. So they started inventing this onion system. And it turns out in these onion systems, in these hiding your traffic systems, it only works if there's a lot of other people using it. There's this saying that anonymity loves company. If I'm the only one using Tor, then Russia or whoever knows that, well, if it's a Tor connection, it must be the State Department. But if all the universities in America and around the world are also using it, then you're not sure who's coming to your site. So it turns out, to try to be private, you actually need tons and tons of normal traffic to hide your true intentions in. So that's why you come up with these weird tension points where the State Department is funding Tor with one hand, and the FBI is trying to break Tor with the other hand. Same government, different goals. Okay, I'm going to take a break. I think somebody had a question in the... Sir.
Is it really anonymous? like no security services of any state can't really find you when you're using Tor.
Oh, well, people have been arrested all the time on Tor. Yeah, and so the states don't tell us how they're doing it, but researchers guess, right? Historically, there have been problems with the browsers. If you run JavaScript, there's attacks against the JavaScript in your browser that will unmask your true IP address. A lot of times what they do is they break into the forum software and gather information, and then if they can get you to read a message, they might have hidden, essentially cookies, hidden web bugs or something in the message that will then beacon out differently. One of the tricks is to try to get you to resolve a domain name in such a way that it reveals your true address. So
it's not that private, is it?
well, if you know what you're doing, you turn off JavaScript. You set up your DNS correctly. You do all these, and at that point, you're an expert. You know all the ways you could possibly be identified. But then it's better if you actually aren't doing anything illegal in the first place, because then they aren't spending resources to try to find you. And what you see sometimes is some of these law enforcement dragnets. There's cases where there was a service provider on Tor, and I think it was called Freedom Hosting, and they had a lot of bad websites hosted, and they had a lot of legitimate websites hosted, but the entire network it came under attack because of some of the hosts. Law enforcement took down a huge section. They injected malicious JavaScript to unmask users. Well, they were going after the small subset of users, and they unmasked tens of thousands of users. So was that minimization? Should they have swept everybody up? How do they know who's guilty and who's not? We don't know. That's an unresolved question. Like, how much care do you have to put into unmasking someone on one of these networks? But I don't think there exists, and maybe Olaf or someone can, or Bill, there's no network that you're 100% safe on, because people make mistakes. And criminal platforms generally are social in nature, which means they're open to social attacks, other members that are untrusted, those kinds of things. So I'm not as worried about it as some people, because I see so many alternatives for bad guys, from letters to handy notes to prepaid cell phones to, and I see a lot of good that can come from these networks as replacements for some of our broken security technology, ways of circumventing, ways of getting around untrusted. Like, for example, if I'm in this country or I'm at home, the reason I run Tor a lot at home is I don't want my ISP creating a profile of all the sites I go to, because they take that and they sell it. It's like, well, I'm already paying my ISP money. I don't want to be monetized a second time. So I use Tor just to do normal things, because I'm upset that they're trying to sell me twice. That doesn't seem right. I can't give the ISP an extra $10 and say, don't collect on me. They're going to collect on me, because they just can't help it. Question?
You can also just use a VPN, which wouldn't be as complicated as using Tor and runs a lot faster.
You could use a VPN, but then with the VPN, you really have to know. You have to really trust your exit, just like exit nodes on Tor. You really need to trust that VPN. And if you look at the cost of the VPN operators and you do the math, there's no way they can stay in business for the amount of money they're charging you. They're making money some other way. It can't be $3.99 a month for unlimited high speed. You can't buy the bandwidth that cheap. So there's something else going on. We found VPN providers doing JavaScript ad injection, so it replaces the advertisements you would normally see. So a lot of them are doing shady things, and a lot of them aren't built very well. They'll also leak DNS traffic. They'll leak IPv6 traffic, and so, like I said, you really kind of have to be an expert in this space. There's not an easy solution right now. Bill?
So if basically you're dividing the world between the places where privacy is an acknowledged social good and places where privacy is suspicious from a governmental point of view, right? So basically,
Yeah, do you have the right to
You either-
try to be secure or,
Right.
yeah.
so what happens to the internet when we succeed in the IETF and essentially all protocols are encrypted and it becomes impossible for neophyte users to comply with the law in many countries and still use the internet? That feels like it's
Setting up
train
for a
wreck we're
showdown?
heading for.
Yeah. So that's a good question. So I think what will happen, though, is a lot of the changes IETF is doing, I think they're providing message confidentiality, but not necessarily anonymity. So you still know the IP address the traffic's coming from. You just don't know what they're looking up. But you know what addresses they're going to. So you might see that Bill connected to the IP address for Facebook and exchanged 5 megabytes. But we don't know what was in there. So we can probably guess. Right. That's true. If it's an Amazon AWS IP address, who knows what it could be because it's dynamic. Right. But then you'll see some of the things that have delayed internet security, like TLS 1.3, is the desire of some companies to do man-in-the-middle attacks. Right. They want to be able to impersonate websites for security reasons, or because the corporation has a policy that says we get to watch your traffic coming and going, and if it's encrypted, we can't watch it. So they're demanding to weaken the standards to allow interception. And I think once that fight is over, it'll get settled one way or the other in the ITF. Once we get over that fight, it's sort of like having a court decision. And if you can get past that, that will set the standard, I think, going forward.
Have you heard of anybody setting up I'm going to call it, for lack of a better term, a black ISP? And what I mean by that is, so one time I visited Terramark, you know Terramark? Yeah. So if you see their facilities, I mean these enormous, gigantic things, right, and they're all over there, and they have these big optical switches. Yeah. And they have an enormous amount of dark fiber, which simply means it's not used. I mean, fiber has been built out tremendously, right? Yeah. And a lot of it's not used. So you can go there, and you can, and I asked them if I was there, and I asked, is this possible to set up basically your own, what amounts to a global LAN, basically, right? Where it's disconnected completely from the rest of the internet. Sure. And I could set up an ISP where I only provide services to select clients. Right. And who can then conduct basically any kind of business they want on it. Right. And there's nobody who can. And I'm totally blanking, Bill. What's the name of that technology? When you go into it's not the cloud. You go into oh God, we used to have. This is how you do leased lines between different companies. Yeah. The problem is one of scale and use, right? Right. Well, almost everything is out on the internet, and those people are going to want to. But what you see, well, so these guys, what they explained was that I could set this up at any scale I want, given the facilities they have. Well, so what you see, right, and so it'd be considered a giant private network. Yeah. And that could be a dark net. Yeah. Well, what you see criminals doing, or people who compromise peering points, or even companies that do a lot of BGP route announcements, they'll announce dead address space. Route address space that's not allocated. Route it for a day, an hour, a week, and then they withdraw all the routes. And so they're creating illegitimate network traffic in the real internet in unallocated space, send spam, do whatever their crime thing is, and then withdraw the routes. So that's also a dark net, because you've essentially hijacked somebody else's, some RIR space, some unused space. And I always find those attacks fascinating, because the amount of skill to do that, and it's like, weren't there easier ways to do that? But in doing so, there's very few people that could trace that. And I'm sure there's probably 3 other clever attacks that I haven't heard of, So I keep going back to the original point. Are you allowed to try to communicate privately? Are you allowed to build a secure system? And if your answer is no, it leads you down a certain path. If the answer is yes, then it becomes really nuanced. Any other questions, sir, over here?
So you describe darknets as having both good and bad uses. Do you actually have any data on, say, the Tor network, how much of it you would classify as good and how much of it you would classify as bad?
Bad. I don't have data, but there have been academic studies done. And there's a web page somewhere that tracks all the Tor sites that have been taken down by law enforcement. So you can sort of see what's been taken down, when. So you can see, and people do that because they're trying to figure out, well, what's law enforcement care about? And it's mostly like carding and drugs in these underground forums. And they don't seem to care about people trying to share cartoons and music and other things. And the other interesting thing, though, is the statistic on a lot of these Tor sites is because, like, you can't tell who's operating the Tor site. The bad guys can't either. And a lot of them are operated by law enforcement. And so I think every time you read about a site, they either break into the site, compromise the site, run it for a while, gather all the information on all the users, and then shut it down. And so when I come across a sketchy-looking site on Tor, it's like, is that real? Or is that law enforcement? Or is that like a prank site? You just can't easily tell. And so it reminds me a lot of the early days of the internet, where there was no search site, you weren't really sure what was going on, and you kind of had to find by word of mouth. And that's a lot. And that's a lot about where it's at. I don't see it changing much. If you look at what Tor is doing, Alec Muffett is putting a lot of energy in creating what he calls the enterprise toolkit, Onion Enterprise Toolkit. He was responsible for moving Facebook to Tor, and he's trying to help other big companies, social platforms, move to Tor. So he's solving a lot of the problems around scale, availability, rate limiting. And the other thing is, the way governments respond to these things is they attack and they denial of service attack these sites. And because it's through an anonymous network, it's hard to tell which government is really taking you down. So it's hard. You can't, like a denial of service attack, you could get law enforcement involved and you could do a search to see where it's coming from. It's much harder in a Tor network to figure out who's really taking down your site. So it also, you have a few less remedies right now.
Milo Jones, IE University. If quantum computing fulfills some of what's promised, how might that change the so-called dark web? It seems to put out of business most encryption, and wouldn't it also, well, you tell me what some of the other waterfall effects of progress in quantum computing might be for so-called dark web.
Already people are working on post-quantum crypto. So the engineers have, I think there's in there an IETF working group on post-quantum crypto. So the cryptographers are already planning for the future of quantum. Right? So in the future, you'll start hearing about more algorithmically agile algorithms. So you could take out RSA and plug in elliptic curve. You could take that out, plug in something else. So I think the more time we have before a quantum break happens, the more the whole entire internet will be ready for the day when quantum comes along. So the other side of quantum is if you build the correct sort of optical network, you can create more of a tamper-resistant network. And you see the Chinese and the United States spending a lot of time trying to build these quantum communications channels. So one part of the government can talk to another part on the other side of the country and be absolutely sure nobody's listening in. Those are the more interesting applications, I think, of quantum. The Chinese are ahead of us, ahead of the West a little bit in this, where they're trying to do something with the entanglement, where they're trying to create communication between two entangled electrons over a distance, so it is impossible to intercept the communication because there's no transmission between point A and point B. It's done through quantum entanglement. That's super exciting. And that would lead to a world where you cannot actually listen into anything. For the darknet, though, I think there would just be a post-quantum crypto change. And also, it doesn't change the fact that hiding behind someone else, anonymizing by mixing your traffic with other people, is a fundamental technique forever. Doesn't change the underlying technique of blending your traffic in with others. I mean, this was how Mixmaster remailers would work. Back when email wasn't even encrypted, you would send it to the remailer, and it would hold the mail for a certain amount of time and then send it to another remailer and hold it for a certain amount of time and send it to another remailer, and then it would send out. So there wasn't really a correlation from the time you sent the mail to the time it was received. And the remailers between each other would encrypt and send the mail, and so it would chop up your mail on equal blocks, mix it in with other people's blocks, and only at the end would it reassemble and send out the final message. So even in an unencrypted network where there was no cryptography really involved, people were still using it to sort of hide their traffic in other people's. So that's why I started the conversation about what do we really mean? And so I don't think we came to an answer. I think we're sort of suspicious of anything we can't easily monitor. And a lot of people seem to have an inherent distrust of all the good reasons, and they seem to fixate only on the bad uses. But we don't seem to fixate on the bad uses of cloud. We don't fixate on the bad uses of prepaid cell phones. How does denial of service traffic? It's because we're not filtering for spoofed traffic. Well, we could mandate no spoofed traffic, but we don't. So that must mean we're okay with a lot of this denial of service traffic because we could regulate it. So it's like almost an emotional response that we seem to have on this one little area of like a very small segment of total traffic. And over here we have all these other harms that we seem to be okay with. And I just want to try to draw our attention that, if we're into harm reduction, there's a lot of low-hanging fruit we can go after to make the internet a better, safer place. And it doesn't entail necessarily this highly emotional, undefined dark net. So I'll be around. I'm happy to take questions and love to hear your thoughts on this. So thank you very much.